When the Grumman F6F Hellcat first appeared in the skies over the Pacific in 1943, Japanese pilots were not impressed. To them, it looked like another heavy, clumsy American fighter. Big, slow, and unsuited for the agile dogfights that had made the Mitsubishi A6M0 legendary. Many Imperial Navy aviators dismissed it outright, calling it a lumbering truck compared to the Zero's sleek, lightweight frame. They believed Japan's mastery of aerial maneuverability was unshakable. This arrogance was understandable. For nearly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots had dominated the skies. The Zero's long range, tight turning radius, and experienced pilots had devastated Allied aircraft from the Philippines to Ceylon. At the start of the war, the Zero outclassed nearly everything it met: the P-40, Brewster Buffalo, and F4F Wildcat. American aviators learned quickly that a head-on duel with a Zero was suicide. The U.S. Navy's own reports called for hit-and-run tactics, diving attacks using superior armor, then disengaging before the lighter Zero could turn inside. The Hellcat's debut came at a time when morale and material were shifting. By 1943, the United States was no longer on the defensive. The industrial might of American shipyards and aircraft plants was beginning to show its effect. Grumman, the Iron Works of Long Island, had already designed rugged naval fighters like the F4F Wildcat, but it knew a new generation was needed: faster, tougher, and deadlier. Work on the F6F began even before the United States entered the war. Grumman's engineers, led by Leroy Grumman and his chief test pilot Robert Bob Hall, studied early reports of the Zero's performance from China and the Pacific. They understood the Japanese fighters' weaknesses: light armor, unprotected fuel tanks, and poor high-speed control. Their goal was to create an aircraft that could exploit all of these. The result was a machine that seemed unremarkable at first glance. It was bulky, weighing over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of a Zero. But hidden within that mass was the key to victory. The F6F Hellcat carried armor plating around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. It could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero instantly. When the first squadrons began flying the Hellcat from carriers in mid-1943, Japanese pilots met it with the same confidence they had shown since 1941. But within months, that confidence would collapse. The first major encounters came during the U.S. offensive in the Solomon Islands and the Central Pacific. In the skies over Rabaul and Bougainville, Japanese veterans who had flown since China faced a new kind of opponent. The Hellcat could climb almost as fast as the Zero, dive faster, and, critically, outgun it with 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. In the first engagements, U.S. Navy pilots reported astonishing kill ratios, sometimes 10-to-1. By late 1943, word spread through the Japanese ranks. This truck could not only take hits but give them back with deadly precision. Yet even then, many refused to believe the tide had truly turned. They attributed losses to luck or to inexperienced replacements. They didn't yet understand that the Hellcat was not just a new fighter. It was a new kind of air superiority doctrine. The Hellcat's creation was a direct response to lessons learned the hard way. When American pilots first encountered the Zero in 1941 and 1942, they were shocked by its agility and range. Reports from pilots in the Aleutians and the Coral Sea described an enemy fighter that could climb almost vertically and turn inside anything the U.S. had. Yet by studying wrecked Zeros recovered in the Aleutians and on Guadalcanal, American engineers discovered how Japan had achieved that performance. By sacrificing protection entirely. The Zero's lightweight construction meant no armor for the pilot, no self-sealing tanks, and a fragile airframe. Grumman's team took the opposite approach. They believed survivability was the foundation of combat effectiveness. The new F6F was built around the pilot's protection: armor plate behind the seat, bullet-resistant glass ahead, and self-sealing tanks in the wings and fuselage. Grumman engineers famously joked that the Hellcat was a wildcat with a college education and muscles. The aircraft's heart, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, was one of the most powerful engines of the war. Producing over 2,000 horsepower, it gave the Hellcat a top speed of 380 miles per hour at 23,000 feet. It could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, enough to meet or exceed most Japanese fighters in vertical maneuvers. Unlike the Zero, which became unstable at high speed, the Hellcat remained controllable even in steep dives, allowing pilots to use energy tactics, diving, firing, and escaping before the enemy could respond. Grumman engineers designed wide wings and robust landing gear for carrier operations. The structure was reinforced to withstand hard landings, and the wings folded hydraulically to save space on crowded flight decks. Every bolt, every panel was built for durability. In testing, the Hellcat could take a cannon shell through a wing and still make it back to the carrier. When the first production models reached Navy squadrons in early 1943, pilots noticed something unusual. It was easy to fly. Even new aviators transitioning from trainers found it forgiving, with gentle stall characteristics and predictable handling. This was crucial. By 1943, Japan's pool of elite aviators was shrinking, replaced by undertrained recruits. The U.S., in contrast, could now train thousands of pilots and put them into aircraft that let them fight effectively right away. Grumman also prioritized simplicity of maintenance. Carrier crews could replace entire sections of the wing or tail without special tools. The rugged airframe tolerated rough treatment, something no Zero could survive. The Hellcat was not just a fighter. It was a machine built to endure a global war. In the summer of 1943, the Hellcat entered combat with VF-9 aboard USS Essex and VF-5 aboard USS Yorktown CV-10. The first engagements took place during strikes on Marcus Island and Wake Island. Though limited in scope, these missions demonstrated what was to come. The Hellcat's speed and firepower tore through Japanese patrols, and most pilots returned unscathed. To the men flying them, it was clear this aircraft could change the war. To the Japanese, the full scale of that change was only beginning to dawn. By late 1943, the U.S. Navy's strategy shifted from attrition to dominance. Carrier task forces began striking deep into Japanese-held territory, testing the Hellcat not just as a fighter, but as the cornerstone of naval air superiority. The first true proving ground came with the campaign for the Gilbert Islands, Tarawa and Makin. The Japanese air defense relied on experienced Zero pilots flying from island bases like Roy Namur and Kwajalein. They believed the Hellcat to be another American attempt to imitate their own designs, just heavier. What they encountered instead was a fighter that could dive out of range, absorb hits that would shatter a Zero, and then come back shooting. In multiple engagements over Tarawa in November 1943, Hellcat squadrons reported over 30 enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of only 2 planes. At the same time, the Hellcat's pilots were refining tactics. The old lessons of the Wildcat, avoiding turning fights, using speed and altitude, still applied, but now the pilots had the tools to go on the offensive. The 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns in the wings created devastating firepower. A single burst could shred a Zero's fuselage or ignite its unprotected fuel tanks. American pilots began adopting what they called boom and zoom attacks. From altitude, they dove steeply at high speed, fired short bursts, and climbed away before the enemy could react. The Zero's airframe could not dive at more than 400 miles per hour without losing control. The Hellcat could exceed 500. The result was one-sided. Japanese pilots found themselves helpless against attacks they could neither avoid nor pursue. Japanese commanders initially dismissed these losses as temporary. They believed better tactics could offset the Hellcat's advantages. But the reality was worse. Japan could no longer replace its losses. Every downed Zero meant a pilot lost, often one trained since the 1930s. Meanwhile, the U.S. was producing over 400 Hellcats per month by the end of 1943, and training schools in Florida and California were turning out hundreds of new carrier pilots every week. In December, over Rabaul, once the strongest Japanese fortress in the South Pacific, the Hellcat proved its supremacy. During a massive strike on December 17th, Hellcats escorted dive bombers through heavy opposition. Japanese fighters rose to meet them in numbers, but the outcome was already decided. Hellcat squadrons claimed over 30 kills for minimal losses. Reports from captured Japanese personnel later confirmed that their pilots were shocked by how much punishment the new American planes could take. The F-6F wasn't just surviving, it was dominating. It was faster, stronger, and could outclimb the Zero in most combat conditions. For the first time since 1941, American carrier pilots controlled the air. The psychological effect was immediate. Japanese pilots who had once ridiculed the Hellcat's bulk now whispered of it with respect and fear. The truck had become a hunter. By early 1944, the Pacific Air War had changed completely. The Hellcat was now the mainstay of every American carrier group. From the decks of Essex, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, and Intrepid, squadrons of blue-gray fighters launched daily strikes across the Central Pacific. Wherever they appeared, Japanese air resistance collapsed faster than anyone had expected. The Marshall Islands campaign in January and February 1944 demonstrated what air superiority truly meant. Before the invasion of Kwajalein, Hellcats swept ahead of the fleet, hunting for enemy aircraft. Within days, they destroyed nearly every Japanese plane on the ground and in the air. Pilots reported entire formations of Zeros wiped out before they could climb to altitude. For every Hellcat lost, Japanese units lost 10. What made this possible was not only superior aircraft, but superior organization. The U.S. Navy's carrier task forces now operated in coordinated groups, several carriers launching over 100 fighters at once. Each formation flew with strict radio discipline and used radar guidance to intercept targets. Japanese radar was primitive by comparison, often giving only minutes of warning. When the Hellcats appeared, it was usually too late. The Battle of Truk Lagoon in February 1944, known as Operation Hailstone, marked the point of no return for Japanese air power in the Central Pacific. Truk was Japan's largest forward base, protected by hundreds of aircraft. On February the 17th to 18th, American carrier groups launched a massive raid, over 500 aircraft, including more than 250 Hellcats. In 2 days, the Hellcats destroyed over 200 Japanese aircraft, in the air and on the ground, while losing only 25 of their own. The skies above Truk became a slaughter. Pilots described Zeros bursting into flames with a single burst of fire, their unarmored fuel tanks igniting instantly. In post-battle analysis, the Navy estimated a kill ratio of 12-1. For the first time, the Japanese command recognized the scale of the crisis. Veteran pilots were nearly gone, training programs were rushed, and new recruits went into combat with less than 100 hours of flight time. Against the Hellcat, that was suicide. Meanwhile, the U.S. kept improving the aircraft. The F6F variant entered production with a more powerful engine, improved visibility, and provisions for bombs and rockets, making it a true multi-role platform. The Hellcat could now serve as a fighter, interceptor, and ground attacker, roles it filled with equal success. Japanese pilots began referring to the Hellcat as the Grumman Cat, a grudging acknowledgement of its dominance. Some even called it the Blue Death. It was the opposite of what they had once mocked, a heavy, armored aircraft that not only survived but ruled the air. By mid-1944, the Imperial Navy's once proud air wings were shadows of their former selves. The laughter had stopped. By the summer of 1944, the F6F Hellcat had become the face of American naval air power. Every major carrier in the Pacific carried squadrons of the blue-gray fighter. Its pilots were experienced, disciplined, and well-trained. Japan, by contrast, was in crisis. The Imperial Navy's veteran air crews had been decimated. Most of the new pilots entering service had only a fraction of the training once required, sometimes less than 100 flight hours before combat. The stage was set for one of the most decisive air battles in history. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would later be known by the Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was the largest carrier-to-carrier air engagement ever fought, and it would confirm the Hellcat's legend. On June 19th, Japanese carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft toward the U.S. Fifth Fleet, hoping to halt the American invasion of Saipan. In total, over 400 Japanese planes were sent into battle. They were met by radar-guided intercepts of Hellcats from Task Force 58. At 10 a.m., the first wave appeared on American radar, 68 miles out. Hellcats scrambled from their decks in tight formation, climbing to intercept. What followed was one-sided destruction. The Hellcats, faster in dives and protected by radar coordination, tore through the oncoming attackers. Pilots described the sky as filled with falling Zeros. Many Japanese pilots never saw the Americans that shot them down. By midday, the outcome was already clear. The Japanese lost over 300 aircraft in a single day. The U.S. Navy lost 29. The kill ratio, nearly 12-1, became the hallmark statistic of the Hellcats' dominance. Veterans of the Imperial Navy who survived the battle recalled being stunned not just by the losses, but by how little damage they inflicted. The Hellcat's armor allowed it to take multiple 7.7 millimeter or even 20 millimeter hits and keep flying. Japanese rounds that once shredded early Allied fighters now bounced off or caused only superficial damage. The days when Japan ruled the sky were gone. On the American carriers, maintenance crews worked around the clock, refueling and rearming aircraft. The next day, when the Japanese carriers tried to retreat, Hellcats escorted bombers and torpedo planes in the final strikes. 3 carriers, Hyo, Zuikaku, and Taiho, were sunk. Japan had lost not just its pilots, but its last major carrier air fleet. After the battle, U.S. intelligence estimated Japan's trained naval aviators were effectively wiped out. The Imperial Navy would never again conduct a large-scale offensive air operation. For the Hellcat, the victory was absolute. It was now the undisputed master of the Pacific skies. What began as a clumsy, overweight fighter had become the weapon that broke Japan's air arm once and for all. The Hellcat's dominance in the skies wasn't just a matter of luck or pilot skill. It was the result of careful engineering and relentless refinement. Every component of the F6F had been designed with combat realities in mind, tested in both laboratory conditions and in the brutal environment of carrier warfare. Grumman's engineers learned from every returned aircraft. Carrier crews reported which systems held up and which failed, and those lessons went straight into production improvements. The F6F-3, the first major combat version, was steadily upgraded into the F6F-5 by mid-1944. The new model featured a smoother cowling, improved windshield visibility, and an even stronger wing structure capable of carrying rockets or 1,000-pound bombs. This adaptability transformed the Hellcat into a truly multi-purpose aircraft. While originally designed as an interceptor, it became equally effective in ground attack and anti-ship missions. Squadrons could reconfigure their loadouts between sorties. One mission against Zeros, the next striking Japanese airfields or warships. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine remained one of the most reliable power plants ever built. In combat reports, it often continued running even after taking direct hits to the cylinder banks or oil system. Unlike the Zero, which depended on fragile, water-cooled systems, the Hellcat's air-cooled radial could take damage and still deliver power. Many pilots returned to their carriers with engines leaking oil, cylinders blown apart, or parts of the cowling missing, yet still flying. The airframe's resilience became legendary. During testing, Grumman deliberately shot at its own prototypes to evaluate survivability. Engineers confirmed that armor plates behind the pilot and around the fuel tanks could stop 20-millimeter cannon shells in some cases. American gunners joked that the only thing tougher than a Hellcat was the man flying it. Its construction also reflected industrial efficiency. Each Hellcat contained over 150,000 parts, yet Grumman's production lines managed to assemble them with remarkable speed. One aircraft every hour at peak output. The U.S. built over 12,000 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945, the majority at Grumman's Long Island facility. This meant replacements were always available, a luxury Japan could never match. The fighter's balance of power and simplicity made it ideal for naval warfare. Its wide landing gear allowed stable landings on carrier decks even in rough seas. The arresting hook and strong undercarriage meant pilots could come in fast and still stop within a few meters. In the Pacific's relentless operational tempo, this reliability mattered as much as speed or firepower. Every feature reflected one philosophy: survivability first, performance second. Unlike the Zero, designed to maximize maneuverability at any cost, the Hellcat's mission was to bring its pilot home and win the next fight. By mid-1944, that philosophy had paid off 1,000-fold. The Hellcat's kill-to-loss ratio in the Pacific averaged 19-1, the highest of any naval fighter in history. After the crushing victory at the Philippine Sea, the U.S. Navy turned its focus toward the next great objective, the liberation of the Philippines. The Hellcat would lead the way. It was no longer just a fighter. It was the spearhead of an unstoppable aerial assault that would cripple Japan's remaining power in the Pacific. By late 1944, Japan's once mighty air arm was broken, but not defeated. Hundreds of aircraft were still stationed across the Philippines, Formosa, and the Ryukyus, defending the empire's southern perimeter. When the American invasion fleet arrived at Leyte Gulf in October, the Hellcat squadrons of Task Force 38 were ready. On October 24th, Japanese aircraft launched desperate attacks to halt the invasion. Radar detected incoming formations from Luzon and Formosa. Waves of bombers and fighters diving toward the fleet. Hellcats climbed to intercept. In a matter of minutes, the sky erupted into chaos. Over the Sibuyan Sea, Hellcats destroyed dozens of attackers before they reached the ships. One group from USS Enterprise shot down 40 enemy aircraft in a single engagement. The Japanese counterstrikes failed completely. That same day, as American carrier planes sank the battleship Musashi, the Hellcats maintained total air dominance above the fleet. But the real test came days later, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. On October 25th, Japan launched its remaining carrier air groups in a final, desperate offensive. The Hellcats met them in swarms. Most Japanese pilots were green recruits, many on one-way missions. The result was annihilation. Hellcats intercepted the enemy long before they reached American ships. Reports from USS Lexington and Intrepid recorded dozens of kills in minutes. One pilot claimed 5 aircraft in a single sortie. The Japanese lost nearly every plane they launched that day. By the end of the Leyte campaign, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective air force. Out of more than 400 aircraft sent into battle, fewer than 50 returned. The Hellcat's kill ratio remained staggering, over 15-1 during the Philippine operations. It was also during this period that American pilots first encountered a new, terrifying tactic, the kamikaze. On October 25th, the first suicide attack struck American ships near Samar. While shocking, the Hellcats' presence limited their impact. Fighters shot down many kamikazes before they could reach their targets. Those that slipped through only underscored how desperate Japan's position had become. Throughout late 1944, Hellcats roamed the skies over Luzon, Mindoro, and Leyte, destroying airfields, convoys, and fuel depots. The Zero was now an obsolete symbol. Its once unmatched agility meant nothing against a better armed, faster, and stronger opponent. Every battle over the Philippines proved the same truth. Japan's air war was lost. The Hellcat had turned the Pacific from a contested sky into American territory. As 1945 began, the Hellcat reigned supreme over the Pacific. The once fearsome Japanese Zero was now a relic, outdated, underpowered, and outmatched in every encounter. Yet the war was not over. Japan still held a ring of heavily defended islands leading to the home archipelago, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and countless smaller strongholds. The Hellcat would be there for all of them. The shift in air combat strategy was dramatic. No longer were American pilots hunting for duels in the sky. Their mission was domination. Total control of the air so that carriers, battleships, and landing forces could move unopposed. For this purpose, the F6F was perfect. Its armor and range allowed it to escort bombers, strafe ground targets, and intercept kamikazes in the same sortie. In February 1945, the Hellcat took part in Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima. Japanese defenders turned the island into a fortress with radar-guided guns and hundreds of concealed positions. Hellcats flew daily missions to soften the defenses. They strafed runways, fuel dumps, and artillery positions, often returning with damage that would have destroyed a lighter aircraft. The Zeros that did rise to challenge them were quickly shot down. Most never came close enough to threaten the bombers they were protecting. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa tested every aspect of the aircraft's design. Kamikaze attacks reached their peak intensity. Hundreds of suicide planes targeted American fleets, forcing Hellcat squadrons into constant defensive patrols. These missions were exhausting and dangerous, but the Hellcat's ruggedness saved lives. Its radial engine could take hits that would tear liquid-cooled engines apart. Even after being struck by shrapnel or small arms fire, pilots often limped home safely to their carriers. By this stage of the war, the Hellcat's kill-to-loss ratio had climbed to an unprecedented 19-1. It had destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. The numbers told the story. The Hellcat was not just winning battles, it was erasing Japan's ability to fight. Its success was also logistical. Grumman's Long Island factories continued to produce the aircraft at astonishing rates. Mechanics on carriers learned to repair combat damage overnight. Engines, wings, and landing gear could be swapped quickly, keeping the fleet at full strength. Where Japan struggled to find fuel and spare parts, the Americans kept their machines flying almost endlessly. During the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, Hellcats operated under the most intense air combat of the entire war. They faced hundreds of kamikaze sorties and endless anti-aircraft fire. Yet again, the F6F proved nearly indestructible. Pilots credited the thick armor behind the cockpit and the self-sealing fuel tanks with saving countless lives. The Zero, by contrast, disintegrated with a single hit. By the time Okinawa was secured, Japan's air defense was shattered. Entire units of inexperienced kamikaze pilots had been lost, while veteran squadrons ceased to exist. The Imperial Navy was gone, and the Hellcat had helped ensure it would never rise again. The aircraft that Japan's pilots had once mocked as clumsy had become the scourge of their skies, a machine that turned endurance into absolute superiority. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific skies belonged entirely to the Hellcat. The Japanese Empire, once feared for its aerial precision and daring pilots, had been reduced to a handful of desperate airfields scattered across its home islands. The Hellcat, which entered combat only 2 years earlier, had destroyed the very foundation of Japan's air power. The U.S. Navy's carrier task forces now struck Japan itself. From the decks of the Enterprise, Essex, and Bennington, hundreds of Hellcats swept inland daily, escorting bombers and hunting any remaining resistance. Their missions included bombing factories, strafing airfields, and intercepting the last of Japan's fighters. Mostly outdated Kai-43 Oscars and A6M0s flown by barely trained youths. The kill ratios in these encounters bordered on the unreal, often 20-1. Japan's production could no longer keep up. Shortages of fuel, aluminum, and even trained mechanics crippled their aviation industry. Many of the new planes arriving at airfields were incomplete or untested. In contrast, American Hellcats were plentiful, well-maintained, and flown by pilots who had fought through every stage of the Pacific campaign. The result was an unstoppable cycle: experience breeding efficiency, efficiency breeding victory. For Japanese pilots, the Hellcat had become a symbol of futility. They could see the difference even before battle: the massive radial engine, the thicker armor, the confident formations flying in perfect coordination. The days of dueling skill against skill were over. Industrial might had taken command. As the U.S. prepared for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, the Hellcat was scheduled to play a decisive role once again. It would provide air cover for the landings, intercept remaining kamikazes, and support ground troops. But that mission would never come. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before the invasion began. When Japan surrendered on August 15th, the Hellcat was still flying combat patrols, ensuring no last-ditch attacks disrupted the peace. By war's end, the statistics spoke volumes. Out of over 6,400 aerial victories credited to U.S. Navy pilots, nearly 75% were achieved in the F6F Hellcat. Its overall kill-to-loss ratio, nearly 19-1, remains unmatched in aviation history. No other aircraft, Allied or Axis, achieved such sustained dominance across so vast a theater. But beyond the numbers, the Hellcat's legacy was human. It saved lives. Its rugged design brought home thousands of pilots who would otherwise have perished. In an era where aircraft were often fragile and expendable, The Hellcat stood apart as a machine built to endure and to protect those who flew it. For Japanese aviators, it was the final, humbling symbol of defeat. They had once laughed at the overweight American fighter. But as the empire collapsed, that laughter was replaced with silence. The silence of a sky they no longer owned. The Hellcat had ended the war exactly as it began it, in control of the air, flying higher, faster, and stronger than any enemy could follow. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the F6F Hellcat stood as a monument to American engineering, strategy, and endurance. In just 2 years of combat, it had transformed from an unproven prototype into the single most successful naval fighter in history. Its pilots had earned over 300 Navy crosses, its squadrons had cleared the skies over every major Pacific battlefield, and its design had rewritten the future of naval aviation. The Hellcat's record was staggering. More than 12,000 built, over 5,000 confirmed aerial victories, and a kill ratio of nearly 19-1. It had done what few fighters ever could, completely reverse the balance of power in the air. When it entered service, Japan ruled the Pacific skies. When it left, Japan's air arm no longer existed. Post-war analysis by both sides revealed just how decisive the Hellcat had been. Japanese engineers examined captured wrecks and were stunned by its ruggedness. Its armor, they noted, was nearly twice as thick as that of most Zeros. The cockpit protection and self-sealing fuel tanks made it almost impossible to destroy with small-caliber fire. Pilots who once relied on agility realized too late that technology and survivability had reshaped aerial warfare forever. For American pilots, the Hellcat was more than a weapon. It was a lifeline. Time and again, they returned to their carriers in aircraft riddled with bullet holes, engines coughing, landing gear barely functional. Yet the plane always brought them home. One veteran described it simply. It felt like flying inside a battleship. After 1945, the Hellcat continued to serve. It remained in U.S. Navy and Marine Corps squadrons for several years, flying patrols during the early Cold War and even serving with Allied nations. Modified versions were used for training, reconnaissance, and night fighting. But the age of the piston engine was ending. Jet aircraft were already taking over the skies, and the Hellcat, a product of raw mechanical power, began its quiet retirement. Still, its influence never faded. The philosophy behind its design, prioritized strength, reliability, and simplicity, shaped generations of naval aircraft that followed. The F8F Bearcat, F9F Panther, and even later jets like the F-14 Tomcat carried the same DNA: survivability and firepower in balance. In Japan, the memory of the Hellcat endured differently. For the few surviving Zero pilots, it represented the moment they realized the war was unwinnable. Many later admitted that the Hellcat changed their view of aerial combat forever. Speed and grace meant nothing against armor, firepower, and industrial might. Today, restored Hellcats still fly at air shows, their massive radial engines roaring with the same deep thunder that once echoed over the Pacific. They are relics of a time when victory depended not just on bravery, but on the machines that carried men into battle and brought them home again. The Hellcat's story is not one of glamour or sleek design. It is the story of endurance. It was mocked, underestimated, and dismissed, yet it became the weapon that broke an empire's pride. Japanese pilots once laughed at the Hellcat, but when the war ended, only one aircraft still ruled the skies above the Pacific: the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The laughter had long since faded, replaced by the sound of its engine, steady, unbroken, and victorious. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.